In my last Stalingrad video, I showed you the letters, the final words of men trapped inside the ruins of Stalingrad. From my own collection and different books, soldiers who would never see Germany again. But those letters only told one side of the story, the words they chose to send home. After the surrender in February 1943, tens of thousands of German soldiers fell into Soviet captivity. Among them were officers, NCOs, and ordinary men who had survived the winter inside the city. The Red Army interrogated them one by one, recording their thoughts, their fears, and their bitter reflections on how Stalingrad was lost. These weren't propaganda statements. They were raw, confused, sometimes broken confessions, fragments of men trying to make sense of the disaster they had lived through. Some still believed in victory. Others had already turned against Hitler. Many felt betrayed by their generals, by Berlin, or by fate itself. In this video, we'll go through those interrogations, the forgotten voices of German soldiers in Soviet hands, the ones who saw the truth of Stalingrad not from a trench, but from a prison cell. Before we start, I would love a like and a subscribe if you have not already. Both help me a ton. Thank you. On January 31st, 1943, the unthinkable happened. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, once the proud commander of the German 6th Army, was taken prisoner by the Soviets. That same day, the exhausted remnants of his southern pocket laid down their arms. 2 days later, the northern sector, under General Karl Strecker, followed suit. Stalingrad, the once glorious symbol of German might, had fallen into silence. What remained of the Wehrmacht was now marching east, not as victors, but as captives. Tens of thousands of shattered, frostbitten German soldiers were herded into captivity, trudging through the snow, hollow-eyed and broken. But the Soviets did not merely see prisoners. They saw an opportunity, a battlefield victory, yes, but now a psychological one awaited. By February 5th, the Soviet intelligence apparatus was already hard at work. Captain Zyonchkovsky, along with Majors Koltinin and Lehrmann, began a systematic effort to extract information from those captured in the northern pocket. These weren't ordinary interrogations. They were political dissections, probing, detailed, and coldly strategic. Zyonchkovsky kept meticulous records. After the war, these documents, interrogation transcripts, psychological profiles, and field notes were submitted to Isaac Mintz's Historical Commission. They read like a window into the minds of the defeated, raw, unfiltered. The testimonies of named prisoners, given just hours or days after their surrender, reveal a chilling honesty, confusion, disillusionment, ideological cracks, and the early signs of collapse within Hitler's once feared war machine. Soon after Stalingrad's guns went silent, Zyonchkovsky, now promoted to major, gave a lecture to Soviet military intelligence staff. The topic, the purpose of politically driven interrogations. His message was clear. The goal wasn't just to gather intelligence, it was to assess the spiritual and ideological state of the enemy, to map their political moral condition. Did the German troops still believe in victory? Were they mentally resilient? How deeply had Nazi ideology penetrated their ranks? And just as importantly, where were the cracks? Soviet political officers believed that, like their own Red Army soldiers, the Wehrmacht drew much of its strength from belief. Belief in a cause, in leadership, in destiny. Break that belief and you break the army. The intelligence staff were taught to look beyond tactics and strategy. They had to understand faith, propaganda, loyalty, fear, doubt. Every answer they extracted was a potential weapon, not for the battlefield but for the mind. Zyonchkovsky's unit also had a unique specialization, the analysis of enemy propaganda. Their interrogations included pointed questions about Soviet psychological warfare. What worked, what didn't, which leaflets made German soldiers pause, and which ones were laughed off. According to some prisoners, the early Soviet propaganda attempts were crude. Leaflets filled with clumsy slogans, poorly translated messages, or absurd caricatures that were more amusing than persuasive. One German soldier even said he didn't understand why the Soviets kept calling them fascists, a term he found disconnected from his reality. But the Soviets listened, they learned, and they adapted. These interrogations weren't about revenge, they were about refinement, turning each broken soldier into a map of the Wehrmacht's vulnerabilities, what they feared, what they doubted, what they no longer believed. What unfolded after the fall of Stalingrad wasn't just the collapse of a German army, it was the beginning of an ideological counter-offensive, one that would echo all the way to Berlin. In the days following the collapse of the Stalingrad front, Major Zyonchkovsky didn't just lead interrogations, he laid the groundwork for a new kind of warfare, one fought in the mind. In a lecture to Soviet intelligence staff, he explained the art and science behind questioning the enemy, not through brute force, but through control, psychology, and calculated words. The most effective method, he taught, was the individual interrogation. One interrogator, one prisoner. No audience, no fellow soldiers watching, no superiors to impress or fear. Alone, stripped of status and support, a man became far more likely to talk. Group settings encouraged silence, bravado, or rehearsed lies. But solitude? That left cracks, and cracks could be pried open. But there were limits too. The interrogator was not to fraternize. Soviet officers, Zyonchkovsky stressed, had to maintain their honor and dignity. They were not to become friends with the enemy. Familiarity would only dull the edge. Still, there were rare exceptions. High-ranking officers, for instance, those with strategic information, might be approached with a more relaxed style, a calm tone, a warm room, maybe even a cup of tea, but only when it served a purpose. The key was control, and that meant preparation. To leave an impression, the interrogator had to shock the prisoner with knowledge, revealing details about his unit, his commander's name, or his regiment's movements before a single question was asked. It was a power play, a psychological strike before the first answer was given. Each question, Zyonchkovsky insisted, had to be deliberate, crafted with intent. A poor question could close a door forever. For example, simply asking, "Are you a Nazi?" was almost useless. Of course, the answer would be no, but instead, the phrasing could shift the frame. "When did you join the Nazi party?" A subtle change, but one that assumed guilt and forced a moment of hesitation. That moment could reveal far more than the answer itself. Between February 5th and 9th, most of these interrogations took place in a command post 30 miles north of Stalingrad, in Dubovka, at the headquarters of the 66th Soviet Army. There, in small rooms filled with smoke, frost, and fatigue, Soviet officers worked through a steady stream of prisoners, German soldiers of all ranks, pulled from the ruins of the city. The information gathered was priceless. These broken men gave detailed accounts of the final, desperate weeks inside the Stalingrad pocket, accounts of how their units collapsed, how food ran out, how the fighting turned into senseless bloodletting. They spoke of the Wehrmacht's diminishing effectiveness, of morale plummeting, and of the sheer strength of the Red Army assaulting them from every side. The reports uncovered stories never before recorded. Differences in leadership styles between General Karl Strecker and General Arno von Lenski. Strecker fought until the bitter end, clinging to a shrinking perimeter and trying to maintain discipline even as his men starved. Von Lenski, on the other hand, took a more pragmatic approach as surrender loomed, his focus shifting to survival rather than hopeless resistance. The German prisoners also spoke of the suffering of Soviet POWs, how Russian soldiers in German custody had been treated brutally, denied food, shelter, or dignity. One could hear a note of unease in their voices as they described it, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, because now the roles were reversed. Inside the 6th Army's final strongholds, there was no longer any illusion of victory. Men were dying of frostbite, hunger, disease. The winter wind screamed through shattered buildings. Soviet artillery pounded the ruins without pause. Air attacks roared day and night. The psychological toll was immense. The fear was constant, and yet many soldiers still fought on. Why? The reports give us a glimpse into their minds. For some it was stubbornness. For others, a hollow sense of duty. But for many, The answer was fear, fear of what surrender might mean. Would they be tortured, shot, starved to death in some frozen prison? And in this regard, the Soviet propaganda campaign had largely failed, at least early on. When the Soviets dropped leaflets promising kind treatment and warm camps, most Wehrmacht soldiers laughed them off. The images of well-fed German POWs in cozy barracks were dismissed as fabrications, lies, tricks. No one believed capture was anything but a death sentence. But something began to change. In the final days of the battle, Soviet units adjusted their approach. They began to release certain captured German soldiers after feeding them, giving them cigarettes, treating them with dignity, and allowing them to return to their lines. These returned prisoners became living proof that surrender didn't always mean the end. Word spread quietly, desperately. Among starving men, even the faintest whisper of survival could become a reason to stop fighting. It worked. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, more men began laying down their arms. Zyonchkovsky's mission had never been just about intelligence. It was about undermining the foundation of the German war machine, not with bombs, but with doubt. His team learned which questions to ask, which words carried weight, which gestures, like a cigarette or a loaf of bread, could break a soldier's last sense of resistance more effectively than any rifle. The Battle of Stalingrad had been won on the ground. But what came next, the slow, systematic unraveling of enemy morale, was a victory of another kind, a quieter one, but just as devastating. Yet despite all the effort, the data gathered through these interrogations couldn't quite offer a reliable portrait of what German morale truly looked like in those final, frozen days at Stalingrad. The reason was simple. The conditions themselves, both physical and procedural, made honest testimony difficult. Interrogations occurred under stress, fear, and hunger. The protocols were rigid, the atmosphere tense, and most importantly, both sides had learned the same harsh lesson. Prisoners often say what their captors want to hear. A striking example of this dilemma came from a man named Senior Lieutenant Otto Conradi, an intelligence officer with the German 389th Infantry Division. Back in the summer and autumn of 1942, he had interrogated captured Soviet soldiers during the early stages of the Stalingrad campaign. They told him they fought only because they were forced to, driven by threats of violence, and often left without food for days. But when Conradi passed on their statements to his commanding officer, they were immediately dismissed as lies. After all, the Red Army was fighting with fierce resistance in the city's ruins. The brutality his division encountered did not match the picture of starving, broken men fighting under duress. From that contradiction, a clear truth emerges. Soviet prisoners lied, German prisoners lied. Whether out of fear, desperation, ideological conditioning, or a desire to please, most told their captors some version of what they believed they wanted to hear. The truth, if it existed at all, lay buried beneath layers of performance and pressure. And yet, some statements stood out, disturbing in their clarity and jarring in their content. One of the most revealing testimonies came from Hermann Lüben, a general staff officer. He declared without hesitation that the German soldier would ultimately triumph, thanks, he said, to the deep-rooted ideological conditioning of National Socialism. But his faith in victory came with a warning. Lüben believed the blood purity of the German people had been compromised, and he blamed Germany's recent failures not on strategic mistakes or overwhelming Soviet force, but on their non-Aryan allies, specifically the Italians and Romanians. In his view, the Reich had faltered not because of its own limitations, but because it had allowed racial inferiors to fight by its side. Then came the testimony of platoon leader Ernst Eichhorn of the 24th Panzer Division, a man whose words leave a lasting, unsettling impression. At first glance, Eichhorn seemed reasonable, even reflective. He expressed surprise at the humane treatment the prisoners had received and admitted that many German soldiers had begun asking why this war between Germans and Russians was even being fought in the first place. It might have seemed like a breakthrough, a moment of clarity in the rubble. But then came the final line of the report. Eichhorn concluded that for him and for many of his fellow officers, there was no doubt who bore responsibility for the war: the Jews. He claimed they had taken control of governments and institutions across Europe, everywhere, he said, except Germany. This closing remark, dropped so casually, revealed the chilling truth. Even after defeat, even after Stalingrad, even face-to-face with Soviet interrogators, Eichhorn held fast to the racial hatred that had fueled the Third Reich from the start. What's more, the interrogating officer, Major Lehrenmann, was himself Jewish. Eichhorn either didn't know or couldn't fathom that a Jew could hold such a position of power within the Red Army. Either way, his final sentence exposed the depth of the ideological thinking that still gripped many among the German officer corps. For Soviet intelligence, this wasn't just information, it was a reminder that though the Sixth Army had been buried in the snow and ash of Stalingrad, the ideology it served was still very much alive. The battle for territory had ended, but the battle for truth and for memory was just beginning. On the political interrogation of POW Senior Lieutenant Max Hüttler, Dubovka, February 6, 1943, interrogated by Major Koltinin, head of 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army, and Quartermaster Technician 2nd Class Gersch, Interpreter, 99th Rifle Division. Max Hüttler, 5. Oberleutnant, Adjutant im 444. Infanterieregiment, 389. Infanteriedivision, German, age 34, native of Westphalia, married, member of the National Socialist Party, forestry researcher, instructor at the University of Göttingen, reserve officer, home address, Göttingen University. The prisoner stated, "From the very beginning of the Stalingrad operation, it was clear to me, and not only me, but nearly all of the officers, that our high command was taking a big risk by driving in such an enormous wedge. The Russians were obviously going to try to cut through this wedge, surround our forces at its tip, and move in behind us. But we thought our commanders knew what they were doing. We thought they had enough reserves and would be able to hold our flanks. I still can't understand why they didn't bring more men to the flanks. We had reserves, plenty of them. The whole thing confuses me. When your army broke through our defenses at the end of November 1942, people started to panic. But we didn't know who exactly was spreading this panic. Soldiers weren't the only ones losing their heads. A lot of officers were too, especially the commanders of large units. By Christmas we understood the utter hopelessness of our situation. There wasn't any help and there wasn't going to be any. Each of us realized this, but we were afraid to admit it. We knew that we were doomed. But despite this, most of us didn't even think of surrendering. We'd been tasked with holding back as many Russian troops as possible, troops that would otherwise be sent toward the Caucasus and Rostov. That's what we told the men. They knew what was going to happen to them, and, as you know, it was a small number of worthless men who laid down their arms and surrendered without being ordered to. The main corps of soldiers had been thoroughly instilled with a sense of duty, and they were prepared to give up their lives. Those were the men who held everything together. We weren't bothered by the small groups. They didn't present any danger to us. You say that every soldier is still a man, and as such he puts great value on his life and holds on to the idea of returning to his homeland, to his family, his wife, his children. That's true. But still, the homeland takes precedence. Each of us is able to sacrifice himself for his homeland. This has been drilled into all of our soldiers. When they were in the encirclement, all of them knew they still had to do their duty, and they did. During the 2 months that we were surrounded, there wasn't a single order related to discipline or increasing our monitoring of the regular soldiers. The only thing I know of was on January 27th or 28th, 1943, I don't remember the exact date, when General Strecker issued an order stating, 1. Immediately open fire on anyone who moves away from his unit and toward the enemy. 2. Anyone who takes supplies for himself from airdrops will be tried by court-martial. 3. Anyone who is insubordinate or refuses to follow orders will be tried by court-martial. So why did we surrender? First of all, the main force that was with Field Marshal Paulus surrendered on January 30th, 1943. So continued resistance was senseless. Our group wasn't able to draw in enough Russian forces to justify the sacrifice. We did our job for as long as we could, and if we could have held your armies back for another 2 or 3 weeks, then we wouldn't have put down our weapons. We'd have kept fighting. Second, we had so many wounded that they impaired our ability to fight. They were packed into every other building. All of them would have been killed by artillery fire if we'd resisted any longer. How do I judge the current military situation in Germany? Germany is in the middle of a very difficult crisis, but this isn't a defeat. There's still another 2 million or so who can be drafted. But if your offensive continues at the same pace for another 2 months, then our crisis might turn into defeat. The prisoner also said that one of the signs by which you could determine who would win was Turkey's entry into the war. Turkey would join the side of the victors, but only when it was absolutely clear who the victors would be. I was a National Socialist before the army, and now I'm a soldier. There aren't any National Socialists in the army, just soldiers. I was a company commander from April to October 1942. What you've been saying about the brutal treatment of Russian POWs, this is the first I've heard of it. There was nothing like that in either my company or my regiment. There may be exceptional cases, but they'd have been just that. Exceptions. It's prohibited. It's the same thing with the local populations. We have orders that make violence against the local population an arrestable offence. We're likewise prohibited from taking valuables from civilians, or any of their things for that matter. Sometimes we're given permission to take foodstuffs, the packages with boots, dresses, and so on, that some of us sent back to Germany. Those were things that had been found in destroyed or burned out buildings. Russian soldiers are pretty good soldiers. They're much better at defending than attacking. And here, where they defend in small groups, they do a lot better than they do as a large mass. You have good snipers. Major Koltinin, head of 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army Quartermaster Technician, 2nd Class Gersh, Interpreter, 99th Rifle Division. 3. Interrogated by Captain Zayonchkovsky, Senior Instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Pist, Helmut. Born on January 11th, 1916, in Schwarzenau, province of Posen. Graduated from the gymnasium. Profession, agronomist. Lutheran, German, member of the Hitler Youth. Drafted in 1937. Home address, Krefeld am Rhein, Prinz Friedrich Karl Strasse, 139. When asked about the state of his unit during the final days of the encirclement, Helmut Pist stated the following. In early January, the regiments in our division no longer existed as such. Individual groups were created that went by the names of the officers in charge. For example, a group was made up out of the 21st and 26th regiments, and it was commanded by Colonel Brendel. They also set up these so-called alarm groups. Those groups were different sizes. The one I was in, for example, had 50 men. We were led by Lieutenant Hermans, and we were located in Orlovka. Morale was low. Many were criticizing the government, blaming it for giving up on us. Our food was getting worse by the day. By around January 20th, we were getting 50 grams of bread per day. The airdrop food supplies were being taken by whoever found them, despite strict orders and the threat of being shot. So there was very uneven food distribution in the units. Discipline was worsening every day, and there was more and more talk of surrender. On around January 25th, Lieutenant Kors from Divisional HQ told us that General von Lenski, our divisional commander, had issued an order giving freedom of action to the commanders of all units. That is, he was letting them surrender. But that order was cancelled a day later. Your leaflets didn't have much success among the men before the encirclement, but then the situation changed, especially in January, when the men read them with real eagerness. We were actually looking for the leaflets you were dropping from the air, the ones with maps showing the situation on the front. Those last days in Stalingrad were horrible, thousands of dead bodies, and the wounded men dying in the streets because the hospitals were overcrowded, and on top of that we were taking heavy fire from your artillery and aircraft. The surrender wasn't organized. Our bunker was 50 meters from our divisional HQ, but even though we were so close to them, We only learned about the surrender after the Russians had already showed up. We came out of our bunker and put down our weapons. War in Russia is not what it is in the West. During the French campaign in 1940, our squadron was always out in front, and only 2 of our guys got killed. Major Koltinin, head of the 7th Section Political Department, 66th Army Captain Zayonchkovsky, senior instructor, 7th Section Political Department, 66th Army, on the political interrogation of the POW Ernst Eichhorn, cavalry officer in the 9th Company, 24th Panzer Regiment, 24th Panzer Division. Dubovka, February 5, 1943. Interrogated by Major Lehrenmann, instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Ernst Eichhorn, home address, Regensburg an der Donau, Luitpoldstraße 11a, field post number 11468, German. In the army since 1935, not a member of the National Socialist Party. On the Russian front since June 1941, completed cavalry school in Hanover, born in 1902, campaigned in Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, not married. One reason the surrounded German forces in Stalingrad surrendered was that the front was closing in. Maneuvering was impossible. A massive force was concentrated in this small area with no airfield. That resulted in enormous losses from artillery and airplanes. Another reason was the bad state of the food and fuel supplies. In the final days, the men were getting 100 grams of bread, a bit of horse meat, 40 grams of lard, a daily portion of broth, 2 liters, and 4 cigarettes. They were down to a small number of artillery shells, but there was plenty of ammunition for the infantry. Tanks were turned into pillboxes. Because of that, the whole regiment was operating as an infantry unit. The officers of the 24th Panzer Division understood that the encircled units were in an extremely complicated and difficult situation, but they didn't consider it hopeless. The order to surrender came through divisional command. It was given verbally, and then envoys were sent out, and units from the 24th Division laid down their arms. But the order to surrender came as a surprise to everyone. Up to the very end, most of the officers were still hoping to get help from the outside. The men never questioned their orders, both during the encirclement and when they were told to surrender. That's how the German soldier is trained, to do something only when he's ordered to. Communication with the outside world was maintained right up until Russian units took the airfield at Potomnik. There was no postal service after that. The idea was widespread in the German army, among both men and officers, that being captured by the Russians meant poor treatment, torture, and death. The men and officers had all read the Russian leaflets where it said that prisoners were treated well. There were some with photographs that showed the lives of the prisoners in Russia, but no one believed it. They figured it was just propaganda. During the advance, many of them had seen the bodies of men who'd been shot in the head and so on. That convinced us that the Russians were shooting prisoners. All of the officers in the 24th Panzer Regiment think highly of the Russian artillery. They're accurate and don't scrimp on shells. If there hadn't been any artillery at Stalingrad, and it was just infantry attacking the surrounded forces, then the Germans could have easily fought them off and resisted longer. The Russian infantry doesn't deserve any specific praise. They lack the spirit for an effective offensive. The Russians were a lot better in 1942 than at the beginning of the war, but the German fighter planes are better than the Russian ones. There are a lot of young, inexperienced pilots in the Russian Air Force. The tanks are very effective. The T-34 is an excellent piece of machinery. Russian tanks are very well armed, and their crews are very highly trained. The reason for the successful offensive against the surrounded German army was the simultaneity of the attacks from the north and south, and later from the west. On top of that, the Romanian units, which were positioned on the upper Don, ran away. The success of the Russian assault was also facilitated by a certain amount of panicking in the German units. We began destroying stores of food and military equipment in the first days of the encirclement. That complicated the situation for the surrounded forces. During our advance on Stalingrad, there was talk among the officers that the Russians were counting on the winter, that they were going to time their own offensive for the winter. The German commanders thought the Russians were too weak and downplayed the likelihood of a Russian offensive. The German commanders thought they'd have already won by the time winter came. The officers remembered that this wasn't the first time that their general strategic plans had been upended. It wasn't clear then, though it's obvious now, that the plan was unrealistic. You just can't count on simultaneous offensives on Leningrad and Stalingrad while also planning to take the Caucasus. It's too much. The German commanders were planning to take Stalingrad and then move down the Volga to Astrakhan, but they never took Stalingrad. To get to Astrakhan, they had to try to cross the Kalmyk steppe, 9, and that entailed increasing losses for the German army. If the Red Army continues its offensive as it is doing now, especially if they take Rostov and Kharkov, then that will be of great significance to the outcome of the war. 10. Holding on to Kharkov and Rostov is the most important thing for the German army. A second front in Europe is inconceivable. German forces are on standby in northern France, and the coast is fortified. An attack from Spain became impossible once the Germans took southern France, nor could American and English forces land in Italy. The German Navy wouldn't allow it. To land in Europe, you'd have to plan extensively, but still, it couldn't happen. "Germany has enough reserve forces and materials," said the prisoner. "We can fight on as much as we like." The Russian leaflets often made the men and officers laugh. Russian propaganda hasn't really taken into account the particular psychology of the German soldier, his unique sense of discipline. So, for example, I saw one leaflet that called on soldiers to kill their officers because they were better fed and didn't have to fight, said the prisoner. Another leaflet told them to kill all the fascists and join the Russians. First of all, officers and soldiers eat the same food, and we don't understand the word fascist, which makes us think of the system of government in Italy. During the surrender, German officers were worried about their own futures. People said that if you were going to surrender, give yourself up to the Americans, the British, the French. It's perfectly safe being a prisoner with them. The prisoner asked, "Why are you going to so much trouble over us? We weren't expecting such good treatment, especially from Russian officers. If your goal is to encourage German officers to surrender, then that's very clever. Being allowed to send letters home was very effective in that regard. Now our soldiers say, as prisoners, we can see that the Russians aren't bad people. Who knows why this war got started, why there's so much bloodshed?" To us officers, it's clear that the war came about because of the Jews, who seized leadership roles in the governments of all nations except for Germany. Major Koltinin, head of 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Major Lerenman, Instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army, on the political interrogation of POW Lieutenant Hermann Strottmann, Adjutant 1st Battalion, 79th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, 16th Panzer Division. February 9th, 1943. Interrogated by Captain Zayonchkovsky, Senior Instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army, Strottmann, Hermann, German, Catholic, not married, born May 18th, 1918 in Münster, bank employee, home address, Münster, Westfalen, Hermannstrasse 50. He was drafted as a regular soldier in 1938. In 1941 he was made an officer. He was a company commander in the 79th Regiment from September 5th and throughout October 1942, and since September he has been an adjutant in the 1st Battalion under Major Walter. During the fighting to the north of Stalingrad, south of the village of Yerzovka, from September to November, the 79th Regiment lost between 80 and 90% of its men. Reinforcements were constantly being brought from the rear, but that entailed a significant drop in quality. Most of our losses were the result of your mortars, which we called the Böse Waffe. When asked about the state of his unit in the encirclement, Strottmann stated the following: "The Stalingrad operation was risky. At first we thought we'd take Stalingrad in 5 weeks. That didn't work out, and we couldn't fall back because that would have left the Caucasus group wide open. Our commander's great mistake was attacking in late autumn, which meant we weren't able to dig in and get ready for winter on the front lines. You took advantage of this both last year and this year. If we'd stopped at the Don, then we'd have been able to make the right preparations. Then this catastrophe wouldn't have taken place. The main reason for our surrender: lack of food, men, shells, and also the impossibility of it all. It was physically impossible for us to continue fighting. The quality of our soldiers was very low. Most of them had just been brought in from the rear. We were starving, and most of us were frostbitten. Even the officers were so exhausted and hungry they could barely stand up. There's a limit to what a man can take, and we reached that limit on February 2nd. We surrendered. The surrender was spontaneous. At 6 a.m. I was told that Russian tanks were at our bunker. I cried, got out of the bunker, and laid down my weapon. Moving on to a question about our propaganda, Stroopman said that the quality of our leaflets had significantly improved as of late. At the very beginning, stated the lieutenant, they were quite primitive. For example, you reported that we'd lost 4,100 guns at Stalingrad, but there weren't that many guns in the whole army. Lieutenant Stroopman concluded with the following: every soldier believes in victory, but to tell you the truth, if America enters the war, then we'll have a hard time winning. Major Koltinin, head of 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Captain Zayonchkovsky, senior instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. On the political interrogation of POW Sergeant Wilhelm Vugler, 3rd Company, 79th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, 16th Panzer Division. Dubovka, February 9th, 1943. Interrogated by Captain Zayonchkovsky, senior instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Vugler, Wilhelm, German, Lutheran. Born on March 1st, 1916, in Nienburg-Weser. Member of the National Socialist Party since 1934. Completed public school. Profession, commerce. Home address, Nienburg-Weser bei Hannover, Quellhorststraße 10. There were 80 to 100 men in our company when we got surrounded, and we were losing 15 to 20 every day. Reinforcements were constantly coming in from the rear. Our situation improved a bit after December 30th because we built dugouts and were taking fewer casualties. I was transferred to the rear on January 4th. In mid-January, the remnants of the 16th Panzer Division were assigned to the 24th Panzer Division. All that was left of the 16th Panzer Division was the rear units. The men were feeling worse every day. Until January, we were hoping to get help, but then in January, when we started retreating, our morale plummeted, and by the time we'd retreated right into the city, most of the soldiers understood the hopelessness of our situation. Still, the men were terrified of being captured by the Russians. I've read the Russian leaflets and even listened to your radio broadcasts during the Christmas holidays. We were at the railroad northwest of Orlovka. All the men listened carefully to your broadcasts. Many of us started doubting that our officers were really telling us the truth, but our counter-propaganda was effective, so we didn't believe you entirely. On February 1st, I was wounded near the tractor factory and wound up in a field hospital. On February 3rd, at 3:30 a.m., Berlin time, the chief physician announced that the hospital was being handed over to the Russians in 2 hours, so I was captured. Major Koltinin, head of 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Captain Zayonchkovsky, senior instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. On the political interrogation of POW Sergeant Heinz Hunel, 12th Company, 554th Regiment, 389th Infantry Division, Army Headquarters, interrogated by Major Lerenman, instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Heinz Hunel. Home address: Field Post, number 40,886, born May 27th, 1908. Education: 8 years of public school, commercial high school. Married. Member of the National Socialist Party since 1933. Throughout the interrogation, Hunel, a member of the National Socialist Party since 1933, tried to convince the interrogator that he had become a new man after being taken prisoner. He claimed to have broken with Hitler's party. He explained that he wanted to study our state and ideological systems, that he wished to return to Germany as this new man, or even remain in Russia to advance new ideas, to lead people toward communist ideology. He stated that he used to be far removed from politics. He fell under the influence of the mass psychosis of the National Socialist Party, which, in addition to pressure from his wife's family, led him to become a member. Now, after being a party member and seeing the true nature of National Socialism in Germany, he concluded that Hitler's fascism was an ideology of conquest and enslavement. What the Germans said about communism in Russia turned out to be completely wrong. Seeing what Russia was really like during the war, several words illegible situation. When they were first surrounded, the men hoped they would break out quickly. They expected help, but some soldiers understood even then that the situation was serious. They were thinking that they'd have to spend the winter in the encirclement before breaking out in March or April. The men's spirits were falling by the day. They turned into dull, automatic task doers, completely stupefied. Few even considered the possibility of running away because they were certain that being captured meant being shot. The men read the Russian leaflets, but few believed them. Hünel talked about a German soldier who returned from Russian captivity. He said that at around 8 p.m. on January 8th, a certain Holzapfel appeared in the company's bunker. He said he'd been a prisoner of the Russians for 24 hours. He'd been fed, given a lot of bread, offered tobacco. Holzapfel said he'd only seen German prisoners being treated well, that he saw how well dressed the Russian soldiers were, how well armed they were. Among those present was the commander, Sergeant Polter. He cut him off, saying that it was all propaganda, that they'd fed him on purpose, that it wasn't really like that for prisoners. Polter brought Holzapfel to the battalion commander, Captain Bittermann. No one saw Holzapfel after that. Who knows where he disappeared to? 3 days before the Holzapfel incident, there was talk among the soldiers that someone had come back from Russian captivity, saying their prisoners were being treated well. After Holzapfel's disappearance, people were saying that there must be some truth to his story. The prisoner stated, "I told the men to calm down. Let's see what happens. Maybe we'll be surrendering. Don't be afraid, just do what you're told." On January 10th, when units of the Red Army were beginning an attack, Hünel apparently ordered everyone to get dressed and head out. I had 7 men and 2 machine guns at my disposal. We were supposed to defend ourselves, and we could have, but when the Russians came, I ordered my men to put their hands up. 6 of the 7 did so, and the last one ran to the telephone to tell the company commander what was happening. He was killed by the approaching Russians, and the rest gave themselves up. All the men are ready to surrender, but they've got to have an order. Very few of them will surrender without an order from their superiors. They've grown so dull and weak that they've lost the ability to think for themselves. Another reason German soldiers don't surrender is because they consider it cowardice and a betrayal of their comrades. But if they're ordered to surrender, then whoever gave the order takes on the responsibility. Supervision had to be stepped up because of the recent decline in morale. Everything possible was being done to reassure the men. The officers were always saying, "Just wait, it's all going to get better soon." At the beginning of January, all the German newspapers published Göring's speech, where he said that everyone in the encirclement at Stalingrad would be going on leave and getting some sort of package from the Führer. He said that food was coming from the Ukraine and that the soldiers had nothing to worry about. The men read that speech, and many of them laughed bitterly. All of them had spent the summer fighting in units that had taken heavy losses. Promises of relief came and went without anything happening. The units in the encirclement had been promised help before, but none had come. That made this speech impossible to believe. The men had recently begun to notice that those who showed dissatisfaction or a harmful disposition would be monitored. The Nazis volunteered to keep an eye on other soldiers because they wanted to gain favor through espionage. No one was ordered to spy on other soldiers, but the Nazis considered it their duty. The soldiers often tell one another that the officers live for themselves, that they're more interested in medals than the affairs of their company or the fate of their men. Major Koltilin, head of the 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Major Lerenman, instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. On the political interrogation of POW Sergeant Karl-Heinz Pütz, 64th Regiment, captured on January 10th by units of the 343rd Rifle Division, January 11th, 1943. Interviewed by Captain Zayonchkovsky, Senior Instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army, born on May 15th, 1924, in Cologne. Home address, Cologne, Nippes, Escher Straße, 21. Father, electrician. Completed primary and secondary school, German, Catholic. He joined the army in September 1941 and was placed in a reserve motorcycle battalion stationed in Iserlohn. He worked as the battalion's small arms armourer. He arrived on the Russian front in September 1942 in the 64th Regiment of the 16th Panzer Division. When the Russians were surrounded, the prisoner was in an independent detachment that was formed mostly out of units from the 16th Panzer Division. The detachment included 2 battalions of soldiers from the 64th and 79th Regiments and the 16th Motorcycle Battalion, and also 1 battalion from the 544th Regiment of the 389th Division. The 1st Battalion, which is where Pütz was, had 45 to 50 men. There were about as many men in the 2nd Battalion. The Infantry Battalion was around 150 to 200 men. Captain Dornmann was in charge of the detachment. The 1st Battalion had only 1 officer, Lieutenant Schlipper, who'd flown in straight from Germany on January 1st. According to the prisoner, cargo planes are still bringing in ammunition, food, fuel, and also replacement officers. The detachment occupied the area from Hill 137.8 to the southern slopes of Hill 139.7. Food. The men are currently getting 200 grams of bread per day, 400 grams every second day, 40 grams of canned meat, and cold soup without the least bit of fat. The horses have all been eaten. Vitamin tablets are also given out daily. During his time in the encirclement, the prisoner once received 80 grams of butter. 300 grams of chocolate were issued on Christmas, and 100 grams for New Year's. "The men are starving," said the prisoner. "What they gave us today for 7 men is roughly equal to the daily rations of an entire battalion." The heating situation is also very bad. Wood is brought in once a week, but only enough for one day to heat a stove 2 or 3 times. The men use timber from unoccupied bunkers for heating, but there's not much of that. A lot of people have frostbite. For example, 25 to 30 men in the battalion got frostbite on December 25th. Now they're all with the baggage train since the hospital is full. Morale is low. Most of the men think the situation is hopeless, though the officers do try to reassure them, saying that help is on the way, that the main forces of the German army are no more than 40 kilometers from the encirclement. The men are afraid of being captured by the Russians because the officers have convinced them they'll be shot. Pütz learned the truth of the matter from the soldier Holzapfel, who visited him in his bunker on the night of January 9th. Pütz was on duty at the time and saw Holzapfel cross over from the Russian side. Holzapfel came into the bunker all excited, and he started telling them right away about the good conditions in Russian captivity, and then he took some bread out from his pocket and shared it around. There were 7 men in the bunker, along with a sergeant from the infantry battalion that Holzapfel belonged to. The sergeant asked Holzapfel to come with him to the baggage train. The next night another soldier told him that redhead Holz will be shot for betraying his country. The soldiers sympathized with Holzapfel and blamed him only for not being careful enough. Regarding the circumstances of his own capture, Pütz said the following: "On January 10th, when the attacking Russians were coming right up to our bunker, the sergeant told us that resistance was futile and that we had to surrender. When we put our hands up, we started taking fire from the other bunkers. I got hit, and my comrade Private First Class Hilbeck was killed." On the political interrogation of POW Major Hermann Lüben, Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief of Logistics, 389th Panzer Division. Dubovka, February 5, 1943. Interrogated by Major Lerenman, Instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Major Hermann Lüben, born in 1908, in the Army since 1939. Graduated from the General Staff Academy in 1940. Home address, Deutsch Eilau, Hindenburgstrasse 32. The prisoner worked for the German Ministry of War, after which, according to him, he took part in the design and construction of military fortifications in the Netherlands after the German occupation. He was in France. He participated in the campaigns against Poland, Belgium and the Netherlands, and he was involved in the disbanding of the French army. While working for the General Staff, Lüben took part in and even directed the formation of new military units. As part of his duties, Major Lüben rotated through a diverse range of officer circles in the German army. During his interrogation, the prisoner said that because of the blows struck by the Red Army against the German war machine, the top brass were trying even harder to align their officer corps with the National Socialist Party. With that in mind, they were propagandizing the theory that it was the policies of the National Socialist Party which were responsible for the victories of the German army, and for the same reason the older military leaders, who were sympathetic to the political opposition, were being replaced by generals who were clear supporters of Hitler. The prisoner said that recently, in light of the failure of the German army's strategic plans in Russia, there is now a pressing need to merge the officer corps with the leadership of the National Socialist Party. From the moment Hitler and his government took power, they had the support of the vast majority of the officer corps. For a time, the German army's military successes in Europe increased Hitler's authority, but the war with Russia, the collapse of their reckless plans to march on Moscow to break through to Rostov and Stalingrad, has significantly undermined Hitler's prestige. An idea has been circulating among the officers that there are favourable and unfavourable seasons for Germany. That is, many believe that Germany can and will be victorious in a summer campaign, but that winter favours the Red Army. The prisoner confirmed that the officer corps held such a view of the High Command's strategic plans, but that they did not go so far as to express their disagreements openly. Many of the generals, including General Brauchitsch, 12th, opposed the plan to advance on Rostov and Stalingrad, but they expressed their disagreement only by suggesting alternative plans. All discussion of the matter stopped when they received their orders. But among the other officers, criticism of the risks involved in taking Stalingrad was heard all the more strongly. Describing the situation on the fronts and his own outlook on the war, the prisoner stated, "The defeat at Stalingrad and the Red Army's advances to the west and southwest have come as a heavy blow to the German army. But this isn't enough for us to start talking about a real turning point at the front, or about the beginnings of a German defeat. If the Red Army manages to take back Rostov and Kharkov, then that would be a strong indicator of a turning point. Then you might begin to say that the fortunes of war have turned against the German army." The prisoner concluded, "But it's hard to believe that the Red Army could manage to take those cities." During his interrogation, Major Lüben said that it was wrong to think that Germany has exhausted its manpower or reached its limit. Because of the policy of using foreign workers and POWs in its industries, Germany can call up 10 or perhaps 12 million men, counting both men who, of military age, and those who have until now been granted exemption. Also, the German army can still bring in large numbers of men from the hospitals. The prisoner nevertheless stated that productivity is low among foreign workers and POWs who are forced to work. And there is also the problem of blood purity. There are special laws that prohibit these groups from associating with the rest of the population, but the preservation of blood purity is still precarious, and this has become a problem. The next thing that gave the prisoner hope of a favourable outcome to the war was his trust in the unwavering discipline of the German army. Despite obvious tactical and strategic miscalculations, the level of discipline in the German army, according to the prisoner, gives them the possibility of later offensive operations when the time is right. The main reason for all their misfortune, he thinks, is the weakness of their allied armies. The tragedy of the Italian army is that their junior officers have not been properly trained and assigned to the right positions. The educational system in the Italian army does not encourage, but rather discourages the formation of junior officers who will play a decisive role on the battlefield. The Romanians make good soldiers. You can get things done with them. But before the war, their officers spent their time in cafes doing business of their own. They weren't training their men, which is why the Romanian army is seriously flawed. Yes, it's too bad we have to work with such allies, concluded Lubin. He accounted for the increasing numbers of Germans who were surrendering by saying that they have been let down by their allies, and he denied any lack of discipline in the German army. Concerning relations with the populations of countries occupied by Germany, the prisoner said the following: "In France there have been a number of occasions of people shooting at German soldiers in the streets, but we don't expect any uprising in France. The French have always been a frivolous people, and now they've learned nothing from their defeat. They just sing and dance as they did before." In response to the suggestion that the prisoner might only have seen life in France from the window of a cafe or German restaurant, he said that he was giving his own impressions and that he didn't know the feelings of the general masses. He also came across displays of ill will toward the Germans in Belgium and the Netherlands. He said that it had to do with people in commerce and industry whose businesses were disrupted when the Belgian and Dutch colonies were seized. German soldiers and officers thought bad things about Russian captivity, not only because surrender is considered cowardice and treason, but also because very little is known about how prisoners are actually treated in Russia. If POWs were able to write home, then people would think better of them, even in the army. That would dispel all the rumors that are circulating about being taken prisoner in Russia. Major Koltilin, head of the 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Major Lerenman, instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. On the political interrogation of Senior Lieutenant Otto Conradi, Chief of Intelligence, 389th Infantry Division, Dubovka, February 7, 1943. Interrogated by Captain Zayachkovsky, Senior Instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Senior Lieutenant Otto Conradi, born March 13, 1904, in Berlin. Father: police officer, German, Catholic, graduated from the law faculty of the University of Berlin in 1926. Married, 4 children. Has recently worked as a senior prosecutor in Hamm, Westfalen. Home address: Hamm, Westfalen, Ostenallee 93. He was drafted into the army on August 26, 1939. He was in the reserves from December 12, 1939, until November 1940, when he was reactivated. Since July 1940, he has been working as the Chief of Intelligence for the 389th Infantry Division. The intelligence unit at a divisional headquarters consists of the Chief, 03, an aide, 2 translators, 1 draftsman, and 2 clerks, the last 3 are enlisted, as well as 1 sergeant major. When asked about his division's situation during the final days of the encirclement, Lieutenant Conradi said the following: "From mid-January we knew our situation was hopeless, but we kept up the defense because our mission was to keep these Russian armies at Stalingrad, so they couldn't take part in other offensives. It was a difficult sacrifice, but we had to do this for our country. Lately we were completely out of artillery shells and mortars. We had enough rifle and machine gun ammunition. The food situation was awful: 100 grams of bread per day, about 100 grams of canned meat, some soup. After Field Marshal Paulus surrendered on January 31st, there was absolutely no point in us continuing to resist. There wasn't any surrender order in our division. Everything happened on its own, to a certain extent. 10 days before the surrender, our headquarters was spread out over 3 locations. The intelligence unit was south of the tractor factory near the 305th Infantry Division's main medical station. At around 7 a.m., Berlin time, 3 Russian tanks approached the building we were in, and we surrendered. I don't know what the situation was in other divisions. After surrendering, we were taken to Orlovka, and on the way we got robbed by Russian soldiers, who took everything we had. To be fair, the Russian officers forbade this, but they couldn't keep track of everyone. What can I say? À la guerre comme à la guerre. War is war. Moving on to his evaluation of the Stalingrad operation, Conradi said that, even at the beginning, many officers thought it was rather risky. The flanks of the group moving on Stalingrad were exposed. This was okay at the beginning of the operation because they were expected to take Stalingrad extremely quickly before moving northward on the Ilovlin, illegible Volga line, thereby creating a single front from the Volga to the Don and farther west. The Russians' stubborn defense of Stalingrad created another situation that eventually brought them to ruin. When he was describing the strengths of our Russian army, Lieutenant Conradi praised our generals highly, particularly Marshal of the Soviet Union Zhukov, who led the operations in the south. You learned a lot during the war and turned out to be excellent students. Later, when he described the strength of the Red Army's resistance, he said, "Red Army units have put up a stubborn resistance, but the bravest opponent we encountered was in August when we were fighting on the Don at Dobrinskaya. It was the Krasnodar Officer School, Krasnodar Military Academy, Captain Zayonchkovsky. They fought like lions. When we had captured about 100 of them, our divisional commander, General Janicki, 13, lined them up and said that he had seldom seen such brave soldiers." In his descriptions of the individual forces, Lieutenant Conradi said that the Russian artillery and mortars were very good, but that our air force was weaker than theirs. "Your air force did us very little harm, even recently it hasn't caused much damage." When asked about how much the intelligence unit and the divisions knew about the forces they were up against, Conradi stated, "We were always in a rather awkward position. We obtained our basic information from prisoners and defectors. Since June 1942, we've had about 30,000 of them, 95% of whom testified to there being strong anti-Soviet sentiments in the army. The soldiers only fought out of fear, there was a famine, and soldiers in the army would go without food for 4 or 5 days. That gave us the impression that your army was on the verge of collapse. On the other hand, we saw the stubborn resistance by Red Army forces. What was this about? I still can't account for it. I often found myself in the awkward situation of presenting transcripts of prisoner interrogations to the general. Several times he said, 'What sort of nonsense are you feeding me? Don't you see these Red Army units are putting up a fierce resistance?' Moving on to the question of propaganda among enemy forces, Lieutenant Conradi said that this was undertaken by a special department in the Army Intelligence Unit. This department of propaganda printed and distributed leaflets, and they also used 2 or 3 vehicle-mounted mobile radios. This department was staffed by officers, a few translators, and a few sergeants and other NCOs. When asked about the effectiveness of our own propaganda, Lieutenant Conradi said, "Your propaganda is not very effective because it influences only the morally unstable units, and even during the encirclement our men were entirely under the control of their commanders, right up to the last days. We had some who deserted and went to your side, but they were only isolated cases. I think your leaflets had the greatest influence, and as for your radio broadcasts, I'd imagine that they were not very effective. As far as I know, no one listened to them." We knew that you had recently been sending over a lot of prisoners. That, of course, is the most effective method. After questioning them, we usually moved the prisoners you sent us to other units on other sections of the front. To conclude, Lieutenant Conradi was asked about the activities of the propaganda companies. The propaganda companies, Conradi said, are attached to each army. They number between 100 and 120 men. They do the following: publish the army newspaper, for which there is a special editorial team and print shop, photograph combat scenes to send to the rear, and also shoot film to send to the rear. They would have as many as 15 photographers. They also make audio recordings of men and officers telling stories of individual episodes, as well as voice recordings of people talking about various events from life at the front. There were up to 10 speakers. The propaganda companies almost never work with active units on the front. It's only when a unit is brought back to recuperate that the propaganda companies show films, hold different kinds of lectures, and also organize appearances by cabaret acts brought in from Germany. Major Koltilin, head of the 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Captain Zayonchkovsky, senior instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. On the political interrogation of POW Bredal, Waldemar, interpreter, 389th Infantry Division. Dubovka, February 6, 1943. Interrogated by Captain Zayonchkovsky, senior instructor, 7th Section, Political Department, 66th Army. Bredal Waldemar, born in 1904 in St. Petersburg, Lutheran. Not married. His father was an engineer who owned a stone planing factory in St. Petersburg. He studied at the St. Petersburg High School. In 1918, he moved to Estonia with his parents, where he lived until 1940. In 1940, he settled in Germany. Posen. Profession: sales representative, worked for the Untech company in Posen. Drafted on October 2nd, 1942. Arrived at the front on November 4th, 1942, as an interpreter for the 389th Infantry Regiment's prisoner collection point. When asked about their disposition in the last days of the encirclement, Bredal said, "On January 22nd we fell back to Stalingrad, and most of the officers could see that further resistance was useless and would only result in a purposeless loss of life." Among themselves, the officers said this openly and were even surprised that their commanders hadn't begun negotiating a surrender. Toward the end, that was all they talked about. As for the men, they didn't know the real situation, so they kept hoping we'd get help. The main reason that we surrendered was that we'd exhausted all our resources, and also that our situation was hopeless because we couldn't count on getting help from anywhere. On February 1st, the headquarters commandant, Captain Stegner, called for me and ordered me, the interpreter, to go out with a white flag to announce that this building was a field hospital and would offer no resistance. On February 2nd, at around 8 a.m., there was a cry, "Translator, come on out, there's 3 Russian tanks at the door." The Russian tank crews started taking our weapons and watches right away. As for discipline, Bredal stated, "I don't know of many times when it broke down, though it did decline in the final days before the surrender. For example, I saw some soldiers who'd been sent to the front lines show up just an hour later back at the command post, nor did they follow subsequent commands to go back to the trenches." When asked about the Red Army, Bredal said, "Your artillery is very effective, and your mortars are good too. As for the Air Force, it's not as strong as ours. First of all, your airplanes are scared of our fighters, which often shoot them down. And, second, they rarely hit their targets, though lately they've been able to feel more at home since our anti-aircraft artillery hasn't been operating." Regarding the Red Army's commanders, the opinion circulating among our officers is this: the Russians learned how to fight from us, the Germans, and now they can fight pretty well. When he spoke about the condition of Russian POWs, Bredal testified that on January 13th, his divisional command issued an order that called for 2 prisoners to be shot for everyone that ran away. That order came in response to a rapid rise in the number of escapees in January. According to Bredal, the order was not carried out. Your POWs had tough conditions. They weren't getting any bread at all recently, but before the encirclement, they were getting rations of 370 grams of bread and horse soup. What you've just seen are not scripted lines or reconstructed dialogue. These were real interrogations, recorded by the Soviets in 1943, word for word, as German soldiers tried to explain what had happened at Stalingrad. Many of these men were still in shock. They hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Some still carried frostbite wounds. Others had lost entire units, every friend they'd had. And now they sat across a wooden table, answering questions about a defeat they could barely comprehend. Some spoke calmly, trying to analyze the reasons for the collapse, the encirclement, the fuel shortages, the blind faith in orders that made no sense. Others broke down, angry at their generals, bitter at Hitler, or simply silent, unable to process what they'd been part of. And that's what makes these accounts so powerful. They're not written with hindsight or filtered through propaganda. They are the raw testimony of men whose world had just ended. For the Soviets, these interrogations were intelligence, but for history, they've become something else entirely, a psychological record of collapse. If you found this video as fascinating as I did researching it, leave a like. It really helps more people discover these forgotten voices. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We've still got so much more to uncover, from the diaries, the interviews, and the hidden archives of the Eastern Front. Goodbye for now.